because they were supposed to be janitors, supply clerks, guards, laborers, freeing up the veteran brigades to do all the heavy lifting, to do the fighting, and to bring this unholy war to an end. 100 days, men. They'd be back before fall. Daniel Pike got sick almost as soon as he left and was sent back to Windham to recover. He didn't last 2 months, dying on July 16, 1864, leaving his brother Jemuel, almost twice his age, to survive until the 171st mustered out. George Belden didn't even live as long as Pike. He fell ill at Camp Dennison, where he died in the hospital on June 26th. His parents buried their 22-year-old son a week later in the same cemetery to which Daniel Pike would return. And Corporal Horatio Strong, who signed on after an earlier stint of service, lasted almost until the mustering out of the troops on August 20th, before he fell ill at Camp Dennison. He died in Ravenna on August 18th, 30 years old, not living long enough to be reunited with his brother William, who returned from Covington, Kentucky late that month. In retrospect, maybe it's a good thing he didn't live to see his brother return, crippled in a battle that he had no business being in. Because on June 9th, 1864, the 101st Regiment of the Ohio National Guard, 100 days, men, had been sent by railroad from their guard duty at the Confederate prisoner of war camp on Johnson's Island in Lake Erie. They had been sent to Cynthiana, Kentucky, where they were going to serve out their 100 days and go home. But on June 11, 1864, when they disembarked from their long train ride from Johnson's Island to Cynthiana, Kentucky, they literally walked into the middle of a raid staged by that infamous Confederate general, John Hunt Morgan, of Morgan's Raiders. Morgan's Raiders had attacked the small town of Cynthiana, setting fire to many of the buildings and driving back the small Union garrison defending the town. Meanwhile, the janitors and clerks of the 171st Ohio National Guard arrived by train about a mile north of town, where they were immediately attacked by Morgan's Raiders. This regiment, which had been trained to use mops and pens, fought Morgan's forces for about 6 hours. Eventually, Morgan trapped them in a loop of the Licking River, where they ran out of ammunition and had to surrender. Although altogether Morgan had about 1,300 Union prisoners of war camping with him overnight, the 101st Ohio Infantry, including dozens of Windham men, was paroled the very next day and put back on a train and shipped back to Johnson's Island, where they got to tell the Confederate prisoners of war about their participation in the most bizarre battle of the Civil War. But not the 3 Windham boys who died in Cynthiana, Kentucky. William Reed was one. All we know is that he was 22 years old, he clung to life for 4 months, and he's buried in the Lexington National Cemetery. But the other 2 boys, we know better than any other Windham casualties. Corporal Edwin Earl was the son of James and Eliza. He was 23 years old when he enlisted. He grew up on the northern border of the township, and according to his own regimental history, he was, quote, genial and generous, a great favorite at home and with his company. Soon after he stepped off the train at Keller's Bridge, he took a bullet to the chest. As he was being carried away to safety, he yelled, and this is a quote, "Leave me here, boys. Go and fight, and for God's sake, don't surrender." Those were the last words he ever uttered. 6 days later, his body arrived in Windham, where his parents laid him to rest on his 24th birthday. And Henry Milligan was the oldest Windham soldier to die in the war. Almost 33 years old when he signed up for the 100 Days Men. Milligan, like Lauren Woodworth, was a graduate of the Windham Academy. Married at 23, a prosperous farmer, the neighbor of George S. Belden at the southern end of the township. He had a growing family that he promised to see again before the end of summer. And when that rabid horde that was Morgan's raiders faced him, the true spirit of his 3 decades in Windham came through. As his regimental history states, he assumed an elevated position and coolly loaded and fired. His commander yelled at him to be a little more discreet, but the untrained Milligan continued to reload and fire from an exposed position until he finally took a Confederate mini-ball to the chest. Taken to the hospital, he endured the savage pain that mini-balls could inflict for less than an hour before expiring. He came home on the same train as Edwin Earl, and they were buried in a sad joint ceremony. There's only one more Windham soldier to discuss. He was the village's final casualty of the conflict, and he's the one who most reminds us of the devastating cost that war exacts. George Howard was the younger brother of Henry Howard, who had died in August of 1862 and is buried somewhere other than Windham. George Howard wanted to take up the torch that his brother had died to defend, but he'd have to lie to do it, because George was only 16 years old. Somehow, he finagled his way into the 2nd Ohio Cavalry, enlisting on September 22nd, 1862. He never crossed paths with Luther Bingham, also the 2nd Ohio, who was dying in Kansas on the day that George was enlisting. The 2nd Ohio had been ordered home after the Kansas campaign and had spent the best part of 2 years chasing Morgan's raiders around, never catching him, certainly not preventing Morgan's interception with 60 boys from Windham at Keller's Bridge in Kentucky. Because by the time of that battle, the 2nd Ohio, with now 18-year-old George Howard, had become attached to the 9th Corps and was engaged in minor skirmishes in Virginia. His general was Ambrose Burnside, whose unusual facial hair has contributed the word sideburns to the English language. On June 28, 1864, George Howard and his regiment tangled with the rebels at Stony Creek Depot. You won't find the battle in the history books. It wasn't a big battle, except for George Howard. He was taken prisoner in that battle. And he was sent to Andersonville Prison in Georgia. Today, to some of you, but I thought some of you know what I'm talking about. Today the word Andersonville does not have the bone-chilling effect that it had in 1864. But in February of 1864, in the 15 months of its existence, it was built in February of 1864. It existed for 15 months, and 45,000 Union soldiers were imprisoned there. 13,000 of them died. Starvation, malnutrition, diarrhea, hookworm, and other diseases. And Windham's George Howard was one of them. One survivor wrote after the war, "As we entered the place, a spectacle met our eyes that almost froze our blood with horror and made our hearts fail within us. Before us were forms that had once been men, but were now nothing but mere walking skeletons, covered with filth and vermin. Many of our men, in the heat and intensity of their feelings, exclaimed, 'Can this be hell?' It was. 18-year-old George Howard from Windham, Ohio, was buried in a mass grave, the standard practice of Confederate prison authorities. That final Windham boy will always be an unknown soldier." Andersonville Commander Henry Wirz was the only Confederate official to be tried and convicted for war crimes. He was hanged on November 10, 1865, on a gallows located where the United States Supreme Court now stands. Historians believe that the story of the sufferings of the prisoners in Andersonville was one of the factors that shaped public opinion in the North regarding the South after the close of the Civil War. Not that the Howards of Windham cared. They'd given 2 sons, neither of whom ever came home again. 17 Windham soldiers had died to preserve the Union. In the end, they were successful. No one could have given more than they did. And in the 150 years since the first of them marched off to war, Windham has continued to do its duty in times of national crisis. The Windham men and women who have served so proudly are honored and preserved for future generations on that monument on the village green. And every time we drive by that monument, we ought to give a quiet moment of thanks to those boys. Every time we drive by.